Good morning, and welcome to our lecture for class number 22 on March 25th, 2020 for our class, Poli-Sci 303, Diversity in American Politics. The lecture this morning will start out with the same thing I would do if we were in class, and that's to provide some housekeeping materials and reminders. And then I want to provide a little bit of an overview or an introduction to the Treuer book as I see it and the things that he has to teach us as we move through our discussion of Native Americans over the next 2 weeks. So. Here's just some reminders. If you are watching this video before 11 o'clock on Wednesday, March 25th, this will be a helpful reminder that your outline and bibliography for your Native American assignment is due at that time, loaded to my courses. Other assignments forthcoming will be detailed more specifically in the revised syllabus that I will do sometime in the next couple of days. Now that we know for the entire rest of the semester we're going to be meeting away from campus, I will revise the syllabus accordingly and try to figure out which classes are going to be synchronous and which will be asynchronous and how best to play out these materials. I'll try not to make more than 2 synchronous classes a week because I know that can be more challenging for people who are trying to juggle work if you're an essential employee, or maybe some family obligations in light of all the changed circumstances. So stay tuned for that. I will certainly email you all once it has been posted so that you will know it's available. The discussion board has been going pretty well. I've enjoyed reading your posts. I've commented on a few. I will comment on the rest of them later. I would ask a couple of things of you, and I think I've thought of a third since I typed this PowerPoint. One, that you might want to subscribe on each of the threads. You can click a link that says subscribe so that you know if anybody else has commented or responded to what you had to say. And to that end, I would ask that you read other people's posts and sometimes not just add your own ideas, but maybe just add as an appendage to theirs, kind of a response to what they're having to say. I'd like to see this develop into something that is more of a conversation or a dialogue rather than just individualized, siloed comments. So we'll work on that over the next couple weeks, but that would be my goal, to encourage you to think about reading what others have had to say and responding to what they've said. To that end, it is probably most helpful if you do your commenting sometime before the deadline. So if everybody waits until the deadline at noon on a specific day to post, then there's not much of a chance for give and take or reading other people's comments. So those are just some things I'd ask you to think about as we continue using the discussion board as a means of participation for our class. Friday, we'll have our first synchronous class for the session for this course, and we're going to have a class-led discussion. I think Jeremy and Bryce will be ready to lead us in discussion. Because this is a new and more difficult format and will be the first time we'll be meeting all together via Zoom, I would encourage you to be extra prepared in thinking about what your answers to their questions might be. They'll send you those questions by tonight at 5 o'clock, so you'll have plenty of time to think about them. Okay? And next week, there's kind of a quick overview of where I think we're going to go. This is detailed in the present syllabus you have, so you can use that. The only change from that is that I did make next Friday's class a synchronous class session. I'm going to use a tool on Zoom where I can break you out into chat rooms, and you're going to discuss your Native American papers with each other, and I'll move you around throughout the course of a half hour or so, in the same way that you did when you discussed your immigration papers. So that's what we have going forward, and normally I would ask if you have questions on this, but since this is taped and I'm not conversing with you, you should send me an email of any questions you might have, okay? So let's talk about the Treuer book and moving into this section of the syllabus about Native Americans. I think it's important to note the concern that I certainly have, and I think others have shared. I think one of you even commented upon it in your last journal about the terminology or the words that are used when we talk about those people who lived in what is now the United States of America before the Europeans landed. And I thought it would be helpful, and I'll let you read this yourself if you haven't already seen it. This is a footnote on the very first page of Treuer's book in the prologue, where he talks about his own challenges. No, maybe that's the wrong word. I don't think he felt challenged. The decisions he made in regard to the terms he would use. And he notes that he uses some terms interchangeably. He uses Indian, Indigenous people, Native Americans, American Indian, any of those he would use, and he felt fairly comfortable with it. He noted that probably the best thing to do if you are speaking about somebody, that you ask them when that's possible, and to recognize that most Native Americans would want to be referenced by the name of their tribe, of their family, of their clan, rather than by some kind of generic term, often in a westernized language that isn't even native to their own tongue. Um, but the reality is, I think different people are going to respond to this question differently. If you watch the video that I sent you a link to for Monday on the New York Times video on Native Americans and diversity questions, one of the young men spoke very strongly to the fact that he really doesn't like the term Native American, prefers indigenous people or simply Native. So it's going to vary based on the individual. Just something to keep in mind. I think people are concerned about using the term Indian, American Indian, Native American, whichever one you're most comfortable with, unless you're speaking directly with somebody of that heritage and you would ask them themselves what it is that they would prefer. Okay? I think there are probably lots of takeaways. Treuer's book is not short. There's plenty of information in there, but broadly, I think there are two big takeaways that I have from the very first part of Treuer, both in the prologue and the first part. Neither one of them are light bulb moments. They're things that we've probably thought about before, but I think that his book helps to reinforce them in ways that are helpful and meaningful. The first of these is a reminder that there is a history that predates the mythical view somehow of Europeans discovering America. There's a millennia of history, actually, as you see when you look at his book, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But it's just a reminder that life does not start in 1000 when Leif Erikson lands in Canada, or 1492 when Columbus lands in the Caribbean. But there really is a whole history that predates that. And we should not lose sight of that. The second thing that I think he reminds us about, and one that I think we don't think about as often, is that there's no such thing as a Native American. There are a myriad of cultures and people who were indigenous to this land that we now call the United States for thousands of years. And they can be as different from each other as Europeans were from each other when they came and landed on the shores. So I think it's a reminder that we should not try to lump everybody together. And it's part of why I've asked you to do the paper that you're doing for this section of the class, one that asks you to look at a particular tribe or group of Native Americans to try and understand them in some more depth, some greater detail. So that, and hopefully when we have conversations, as the one we'll have next Friday, we'll be able to do some comparison and see what it is you've learned from each other. Okay, so I'm going to talk about both of these things for just a little bit more. If you looked at the syllabus, you might have noticed that I called today's class session Facing East from Indian Country. And it's italicized for a specific reason, because it's the name of a book written by Daniel Richter published in 2003. The full citation is in the last slide of this show in case you're interested. It's a book I've used in the past for a class like this. And it has what is for me a pretty interesting reminder. This, as you can see, is a picture, if you have not seen it before, of the arch in St. Louis, Missouri. The arch was created as kind of a monument, a memorial to westward expansion. We're standing here, and if you're looking at this picture, on the Illinois border, on the Illinois side of the Mississippi River, looking across through the arch, and the idea being that the Europeans kind of moved westward, and St. Louis was somewhat of a starting off point for that. There's also some criticism about that as being too simplistic a view of the purpose of the arch, and this note right here, the Arch St. Louis, Missouri, is hyperlinked to an article from the Smithsonian Magazine that challenges that notion a little bit and recognizes that perhaps this was also a way to engage in urban renewal, which is oftentimes code or another word for moving people out of their community. So that might be worth a read, just an alternative view. Daniel Richter, when in the very first chapter of his book, talks about the fact that he was at one point staying at a hotel, one of these hotels over here in St. Louis, and looked out his window and realized that he was looking east through the arch rather than looking westward. And he said, the reality is that probably more people look through the arch that way than stand on the shoreline in Illinois and look through. And he started to think about the fact that so often, rather than thinking about westward expansion in the view of the Europeans as they looked west, that wouldn't it be interesting to look from the west looking east, or from the view of the Native Americans looking eastward at these people coming to them, and what might they have thought. Whether or not he does an accurate job of teasing that out, because there's very little historical evidence, he has to do some supposition. It's an interesting book. A lot of what is in there you will also find in the Treuer book, but I think most fascinating is this notion that we need to shift our lenses, that we need to think about this from a different paradigm, that we shouldn't understand that story just as Europeans moving west, but as Native Americans watching people come and what that might have been like. I think this quote from the Treuer book sums up well this reminder to us that there was a history here on this plot of land that we now call the United States long before Leif Erikson or Christopher Columbus or the Pilgrims landed in Mayflower, landed in Plymouth. The quote as it says here, rather, as the historian Colin Calloway has suggested, history didn't come to the New World with Cabot or Columbus. They and those who followed brought European history to the unfolding histories already here. And then what you get is a blend, right? So reminder that much was there before the Europeans landed. And for a long time, and for a long time, much was there. These comments here are hyperlinked to an article from Science Magazine, which presents the most current knowledge from archaeologists, scientists, anthropologists about who first landed or inhabited these lands that we call the Americas. For many years, the assumption was that the first Americans came over the Bering Strait, whether that was because it was frozen over or because the water level was lower and people were able to cross. But they came from Asia across the Bering Strait and then moved down, probably about 13,000 years ago. More recent discoveries, and actually this here is hyperlinked to an article which discusses this, indicate that perhaps really what happened was that people came from Asia largely, but by boat, and then came down the west coast and created communities. These are two artifacts from two of those communities that have been found. And the supposition then is that perhaps over 16,000 years ago, or almost 16,000 years ago, this may have started based on some forensic evidence that has been discovered. So when I said that there was a history of people living on these lands for many years, we mean many years. That would be about 14,000 BC that people first started inhabiting these lands. So if you think about Christopher Columbus landing in 1492, there's a whole lot of time between 14,000 BC and 1492 AD, and that there's a history of people inhabiting these lands. It has a history. And inhabit it they did. This is a Smithsonian map. I could not find the exact date that it indicates. This would be approximately the time that Europeans first landed in the Americas. The tribes broken down here by regions and by linguistic families, so that different tribes who recognize themselves as being distinct and unique, but shared a language with others. So that, for instance, I think the Massachusetts Indians who lived more in the Boston area and the Wampanoags on the Cape could communicate effectively because they had very similar shared language, although they understood themselves as being distinct peoples. So this map is pretty helpful. I recognize that it's very hard to read. You'd have to download the PowerPoint yourself, and at least if your eyes are like mine, you'd have to blow it up so that you could actually see it more clearly. But I think it's important to remind us of this second point that I think comes from Treuer's book, and that is that there are many peoples who are Native Americans, right? Each one of those little black words indicates a different tribe of people. And while they shared something in common, as some of these language groupings would have you understand, and while they shared some regional things in common, for instance, the Plains versus the Northeast versus the Great Basin Indians, and those shared geographical locations might have lent themselves to shared ways of life. There are many different people. So I'm hoping as you do your story on your Native American tribe that you will in fact discover some of the specific stories about people so that we can begin to understand them as individual groups rather than as kind of amorphous thing that we call an American Indian, as if there's some kind of standard view of that, right? So I think that Treuer's book does a good job of helping us to understand that as well. So landed on this soil, there was much history here, and there were many peoples here. Right? Now, I would hate to walk away from this mini lecture without some recognition of some of the myths around American Indians. Treuer speaks about some of them. There are myths around Pocahontas. There are myths around Sacagawea. Perhaps the one that we are most familiar with, that we celebrate once a year, is the myths of the first Thanksgiving. I'm sorry, I should have recognized the artist who did this well-known painting, and I forgot to write down the name. But this is some sort of obviously visual depiction of the first Thanksgiving. Obviously, there was a lot of politics, economic concerns, personal interactions, cultural clashes caught up in this moment in time. And our mythical view tends to make that so very simple. There is a book that was published, and there's a review of it or an interview with the author that's hyperlinked here, and also I provided the link on the next slide. A book by David Silverman entitled "This Land is Their Land: The Wampanoag Indians, Plymouth Colony, and the Troubled History of Thanksgiving." I think it's particularly important that we pay attention to that, because where we are located, if you're on campus in Dartmouth, you are very close to the original homelands of the Wampanoag Indians, many of whom have ancestors who still live in the South Coast, on the Cape, and throughout Massachusetts. And so I think it's important to recognize that not only are there many histories, but much of the history of the relationship, particularly between American Indians and Europeans, has been mythologized in ways that usually favors a perspective that the Europeans would want to adopt. And just to bear that in mind and to keep that in consideration as you think about what you have learned about American Indians over the years, and be open to understanding things in a new way. So I have a slide here that provides you with links to the articles I've mentioned that are hyperlinked in the PowerPoint, as well as a link to the bibliographic information on Daniel Rickard's book, in case you are interested in pursuing any of this further. All three of the articles are pretty brief. I think they're pretty interesting, and you might enjoy reading them, so you can certainly download the PowerPoint for yourself and take a look at those when time permits. So, thanks for your time. I look forward to seeing you all in person, so that when we talk, I will actually be seeing your faces on Friday. In the meantime, don't hesitate to email me if you have any questions or concerns. Okay, thanks a lot.